As a filmmaker, buying and researching what gear to buy is almost certainly an addiction that you will pick up. But it's still important to know what to look for when you're buying this gear so you're not wasting all your money on useless equipment. So in this video, we're going to be covering the 3 most important pieces of equipment: camera, lens, and lighting. And I'm also going to give you some recommendations on what gear to buy based on your budget. Alright, so the first thing we need to talk about is what to consider when you're buying a camera. So the first thing is the size of your sensor. A general rule of thumb is the larger the sensor is, the higher the image quality is going to be because it's going to be less compressed. The 3 mainstream sensor sizes are first the biggest, which is full frame, and then there's APS-C, which normally has a 1.5 times crop in from the full frame because the sensor is smaller. And then there's also Micro Four Thirds, which is even smaller than APS-C and has a 2 times crop in from a full frame equivalent. Generally speaking, full frame cameras are going to be the most expensive, but like I said, they're going to give you the highest quality. And that's because it will allow you to have better low light performance, so you'll see less noise in your shots at night, which normally isn't a desirable look. Also, it will give you a less compressed looking image and also improve dynamic range, which basically means the camera is going to be able to properly see the brightest highlights as well as the darkest shadows at the same time. The next thing you want to look at is what the max resolution is that the camera can record in. In this day and age, you should really try to be getting a camera that can shoot 4K, although 1080p is technically the industry standard. Next, you want to take a look at the different frame rates that your camera can record in. So normally slow-mo shots are shot at 60 frames per second, but a lot of cameras, when they shoot 4K video at 60 frames per second, have a crop factor, which can reduce the image quality. So before buying the camera, take a look at the various crop factors that may affect your images in slow motion and if that's important to you or not. And the next thing is you have to consider what system of camera it is. This is really important to understand because different camera companies have way different options as far as lenses go. For example, Sony is going to have a much larger selection of different lenses than a brand like Panasonic might, although they are getting better. It's also important to understand because if you want to upgrade your system, if you stay within the same brand, you're normally able to keep the same lenses you have and save a lot of money by doing that, and also save a lot of time because you don't have to learn a totally new system. Some camera brands, Sony, have way worse color science than others like Canon and can be way less flattering to look at out of the camera. So make sure you're satisfied with the color science before buying the camera. Another important thing to understand is the color depth that your camera can actually shoot in. For example, most lower end cameras can only shoot at 8-bit, which gives you way less color information than cameras that have the ability to shoot 10 or even 12-bit. So ideally, when you're getting a camera, look for something that has at least 10-bit in terms of color depth. Next thing to consider is how well your camera can autofocus, how good the IBIS or in-body image stabilization is, or if your camera even has it at all. Understanding the various video tools that your camera has inside of it, like zebras, false colors, etc. Also consider ergonomics, so how the camera actually feels in the hands, where the buttons are physically on the camera, and if it makes sense to you, and also understanding the usability of the camera's menu system. Some additional things to consider is if the camera overheats a lot, if it's weather sealed, and also if it's actually a good build quality and is durable. So now let's get into the fun stuff. Which cameras do I actually recommend? So first, if you're looking at a budget in and around $1,000 or less, I would look at the ZV-E10. And that's because it has great autofocus, it can record up to 4K, it has an amazing lens selection in the Sony ecosystem, it also has a great upgrade path because it's in the Sony ecosystem, and it's also very easy to use for new videographers. Now the problems with it is it doesn't have in-body image stabilization, it's not weather sealed, and of course it's a crop sensor camera. If you buy anything cheaper than that, you should honestly just use your iPhone in the meantime and save up, because there won't be much difference between your iPhone's camera and that camera. Then I would say the sweet spot price range between $1,000 to $2,000, I would recommend the full frame Lumix S5 II. The Lumix S5 II is better than the Sony ZV-E10 because it has a full frame sensor, it has solid dynamic range, and a great low light performance. And it's one of the first Panasonic cameras with actually good autofocus. It has some of the best in-body image stabilization that I've ever seen. It can record up to 6K, it's weather sealed, it's got a built-in fan so it doesn't overheat, and it has a huge amount of built-in video tools. And one of the main cons with with the S5 II is that when it records in 4K 60 frames, there's a 1.5 times crop in. Now, if you're looking to go in debt, I would recommend getting the Sony FX3. The FX3 is better than the S5 II because it has better ergonomics for video. It has even better dynamic range than the S5 II has. It has some of the best autofocus in the game, and there's no crop in any format, which can go up to 4K 120 frames per second. And the main cons with the FX3 is that there's no shutter angle, and it's also got less video tools than the S5 II does. Alright, now let's get into the next really important piece of gear, and that is lenses. Now, the obvious thing to consider when buying a lens is the focal length. The lower the number of the focal length is, like 15 millimeters, the wider the lens is going to be, opposed to something that's 100 millimeters, which is going to be much tighter. Now, the next thing to look at is the minimum aperture your lens can shoot at. So we're going to go more into depth on what aperture is in the next video, but essentially the lower the aperture, the more light can be let into your camera. Generally, if you're getting a zoom lens, you want to aim for a lens that doesn't have a variable aperture when you change the focal length, because normally those lenses have a lower image quality. Then you have to check if this lens can do autofocus or if it's just a manual focus lens. For example, if you do sports videos, you're definitely going to want to have a lens that can do autofocus well. Then you want to look at if the lens is anamorphic or spherical. Generally, anamorphic lenses are going to be a lot more expensive because they're a lot more complex to make, but they're awesome because they give you a unique cinematic look. Then you want to consider if it's a vintage lens or a modern sharp lens. Vintage lenses normally have a little bit of personality to them, especially in the different lens flares that you get, and sharp modern lenses are just going to give you a very clinical look like I have here. Then you're going to want to consider the weight of the lens. Are you going to throw it on a gimbal? If so, can your gimbal handle that weight? You want to check if that lens has weather sealing as well, and you also want to check out if the lens has image stabilization, because in-body image stabilization paired with the lens stabilization is going to give you a considerably more stable image and can be really helpful when you're shooting handheld. So I can't really give you a specific recommendation on what lens to get because that totally depends on the system of camera you go with, but generally with lenses you're going to get what you pay for. So if you buy a $2,000 lens opposed to a $400 one, you're likely going to have way better autofocusing motors, you're going to get a higher quality image out of it, it's going to have a better build, and so much more. Alright, so the third most important piece of equipment is light. So what should you consider when you're buying a light? So the first thing to consider is the light's wattage. Basically, more watts equals a brighter light. Just as a rule of thumb, I would not go below 60 watts in your light, especially if it's a key light. You want something that can really brighten up the image. Then you want to consider if the light is bicolor or not. So basically, bicolor means you can adjust the warmth of the light, and that's going to be on a Kelvin scale. This is really nice because you can match it with the environment that you're shooting in. However, if you do get a light that's set to 5600 Kelvin or the same color as daylight, the light is most likely going to be brighter than its bicolor equivalent. Then you want to consider the portability. So certain lights you can just plug batteries into. Yes, they're generally less powerful, but if you're in run and gun situations, this can be extremely helpful. Or the alternative is if you have to plug it into a wall every time to set it up, which will allow you to get more powerful lights, but it's obviously a way less portable setup. Then you want to have a look at the mount your light has. So the most common mount is the Bowens mount, and that's going to give you the most options to add things like softboxes to. And then finally, have a look if there's an app associated with your light, because that can be super helpful in allowing you to control the light from a distance or even adding cool flickering effects to the light. So as far as recommendations go for lights, I would say you should get a 2-light setup so you can get one key light, one light as a hair light, and I would also recommend getting some kind of reflector as a fill light. We'll get into exactly what that means in our lighting episode later on, but just don't underestimate the power of lights. For example, look at this shot on iPhone that's well lit versus this shot with uncontrolled lighting shot on the $2,000 Lumix S5 II. I'll be honest, I spend way too much time watching different gear reviews, when in reality, if I just spent that time watching educational content about filmmaking, I could be even further ahead. As a rule of thumb, I would say you should not even look into buying gear unless you're really noticing that you're being limited by the current equipment that you do have. So that's all for the power of gear, but I hope to see you in the next video where we cover the super important basics of camera setting, which will really help you get that cinematic look. So just click right there. Oh shit.